On a cold March night in 2004, a 17-year-old girl finished her shift at work and headed down a dark country road in northern Vermont. Though her car was found reversed into an old abandoned building, no one is sure what fate she met that night. Over the years, the search for her has continued tirelessly, but speculation seems to have spread, confusing fact with fiction and impeding the investigation. Join us tonight for a special interview with Chief Louis Barry of the nonprofit organization Private Investigations for the Missing, where he helps us sort out the facts for the most accurate and up-to-date telling of this story as possible. This is the case of Brianna Maitland. Listener discretion is advised. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Lost Souls of America podcast. I'm your host, Jamie, and joining me tonight is our beautiful producer, Amelia. Hi, Amelia.
Hi, Jamie. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm well. I'm really looking forward to this week's episode.
I'm very excited. We have a very special expert guest here with us tonight. But before we jump right into that, we actually wanted to share a little bit of behind the scenes with all of you. So some of you noticed that there was no new episode this last week, and I want to tell you that there actually was, but we pulled it very quickly after we aired it because it came to our attention that there were several inaccuracies, and it is very important to us here that we are contributing to these causes and not, to the chaos that sometimes happens. So we took it down in order to be sure that the information we were sharing with you was as accurate and up to date as possible. We hear frequently how rumors and misinformation can be harmful to unsolved cases. And so that brings us to our guest tonight, who has been helping the Maitland family in their search for Brianna since 2017. Chief Louis Barry is a retired law enforcement officer with over 35 years of experience, 24 as chief of police. He's been teaching college as an adjunct professor since 1990 at several colleges and universities, and he's also a certified police instructor in a variety of fields for the Massachusetts Police Academies. He's been working as a private investigator since his retirement, and he works primarily on cold cases for an organization called Private Investigations for the Missing, which is a nonprofit organization founded by Bruce Maitland, Brianna's father. I can think of absolutely no better person to share with us the most accurate and up-to-date information on the Brianna Maitland case, and we are so grateful that he's generously sharing his time with us today. Welcome, welcome, Chief Barry. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, and thanks first for the opportunity to get the information out about the case, and secondly for your concern when it was brought to your attention that there was some inaccuracies, which were not your fault per se.
Thank you.
Much of it is things that have been relayed in other media outlets that is not accurate. So it's nothing that that you did wrong with your research. It's just there's bad information out there. That's all.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. And Amelia and I actually spent a lot of time kind of talking about you over those couple of days, how impressed we were with you, because the episode was barely even out before you noticed it immediately, which to us showed that you are so diligent and paying attention to this case. You must be searching hashtags. You must be looking in groups. It made it so clear to us how important this is to you and how hard you're working on this. And we were really, really impressed with that. So thank you for your diligence to this case and to the Maitland family, where we were super impressed with that.
I agree with that. And I also want to say it just kind of shows the passion that so many in law enforcement have for finding out what is happening. And we really appreciate it so much because, as Jamie said in the opener, we also want to be able to give people proper information. We want to be able to have our listeners help solve these cases, to be up to date with things. God forbid, if it was someone in our own family, we would absolutely not want people sensationalizing things or spreading rumors. So thank you so much for kind of keeping us on our toes too.
Yeah, we appreciate it. We've told our listeners before, but we'll tell you too, that the reason we started this podcast is because we both are people that like to watch true crime documentaries and things like that. And for me, I felt this really intense pull, like this doesn't feel right to me to just be watching these people's stories for entertainment. So how can we help how can I contribute to this field? Because I think sensationalism in like the true crime media has really become it's a little crazy out there. And I want to be contributing in the most accurate and appropriate way as possible to be able to help this case, all cases. That's why we focus on unsolved cases and we don't just tell stories for entertainment value. So thank you for being here with us. Now, should we just jump right in?
Sure.
I think so.
Okay. All right. Did you know the Maitland family before you became involved in the case? I'm just curious.
No, not at all.
No. So I'm sure you've really gotten to know the parents and the family. Will you tell us a little bit about Brianna before we tell too much about what happened to her? Could you tell us, who she is?
Again, I did not know Brianna, obviously, but in speaking with her family and her friends, she a very bright girl, very athletic, very popular, very pretty, very outgoing, very trusting individual, and, kind of an independent spirit, if you will. At a relatively young age, wanted to venture out on her own and ultimately, moved out of her family farm, so to speak. Now, the farm itself was relatively isolated. It was up almost literally on the Canadian border. Nothing else around, no electricity. They had, I think, a generator. And so it was, it was a different type of life for a teenage girl.
Wow.
And obviously she wanted to maybe spread her wings a little bit. So she moved out, spent some time living with friends, and she had changed schools and then ultimately dropped out of school, but was working on her GED at the time. In fact, had just completed her GED.
The day that she disappeared, is that true? That was that part of the case accurate, where she had taken the test that morning?
Yeah, she had taken a test that morning. I think it was her final test. I'm not sure. I don't believe she had the results yet, but it was over for her anyways. So she and her mother went out to celebrate. They had lunch, did some shopping. Then her mother dropped her off at the residence that she was staying at with a friend of hers. Brianna had to be to work at the Black Lantern that afternoon.
Okay. So what happened then? She went to the Black Lantern. She had her normal shift at work.
Yeah, she had only been there a couple of weeks. She was a dishwasher. She left her friend's residence, left her a note saying that she'd see her after work, basically. Didn't know what time she was getting out of work, because it would depend on how busy they were and everything as to what time she was leaving. So the people that she worked with said that she was in a fine mood all night. Nothing unusual, didn't appear to be upset or anxious or anything like that. She punched out at 11:20, and that's unfortunately the last time anyone has seen her.
So I heard that her car was found. I heard that her car was seen after that, and then her car was. Why don't you tell us a little bit about those circumstances? About
a mile, roughly, down the road, on her way from between the Black Lantern and where she lived, there was an old farmhouse called the Dutch Burn House, and it was boarded up. Sits almost on the road, very close to the road. It's kind of a unique situation in that the brothers who had lived there, is kind of an aside, elderly men, farmers years ago, had been subject of a home invasion and got beat up pretty severely. They had a habit of carrying a great deal of cash in their pockets. The money was stolen. They were beaten up, like I said, pretty bad. They were elderly. And ultimately, they returned to the house for a short period, and then I think wound up in a nursing home. Oddly enough, the way they caught the individuals that did it was the money that they had, because they were farmers, had an odor of manure.
No.
And they had actually gone to, I think it was a car dealer, the people who stole the money, and they recognized the scent, and they ultimately found out who they were by the odor of the money, which is really bizarre, but that's a fact. So anyway,
that has to be one of the funniest ways to close a case I think I've heard.
Yeah, really, it was.
And so that's how the house became abandoned?
Yeah, and it was abandoned after that. It used to be a barn across the street that had been torn down. The house just sat there for years, boarded up. To get back to Brianna, the house was about a mile from Black Lantern, and sometime between 12 and 12:30, we think it was about 12:15, a passerby saw her car literally backed up and into the house. The right rear of the car was hung up on the foundation. Lights were on. I believe the doors were open. Nobody was around. A short while after that, a second vehicle went by and saw it, and they weren't sure about the lights. They said it might have been a blinker on. They weren't sure. Mm-hmm. At some point, a former boyfriend came by, we think around 2:30. He stopped. He recognized the car, stopped, shut the door, shut off the lights, and continued on his way home. The next day, someone called the state police. I'm sorry, Amelia, did you have a question?
Yeah, I just had a quick question about that. So these two people and the boyfriend, did any of them reach out to the police at that time? Did they wait till the next day? Because that seems like you have three people. This car has obviously crashed. The lights are still on. Did anyone call 911?
No, they didn't. It's a very rural area. There isn't a very heavy police presence at all. It would not be uncommon if someone had an accident or an incident not to stand around wait for police, like maybe, we would in a different area. We've been told if something happens, you're on your own, basically, for half an hour or so, at least back then. Maybe things have changed a little bit now. But no one apparently thought it was unusual enough to call the police until the next day.
So my question for you is the next day when state police were called and the police came, what you said about somebody just leaving the car, is it true that that's one of the things that they thought initially?
That's exactly what the trooper thought. Yeah. He thought someone had an accident, perhaps under the influence, left the car and gone home. So there was some items on the ground he put back in the car. He noticed there were 2 paychecks in the car belonging to Brianna from the Black Lantern. So he went to the Black Lantern and no one answered the door. No one was there. It was closed. So he had the car towed. He unfortunately was heading on days off. So there was no follow-up done on that right away. Sunday night, when Brianna's roommate returned home, she saw the note was still in the same place where she left it Friday night. So she realized at that point that Brianna had not been home all weekend. So she called, I think Monday, she called Brianna's mother to see if perhaps Brianna had, spent the weekend at the house or whatever. And then they started calling friends to see if they could find out where Brianna was. And I think it was Tuesday they notified the state police, said, hey, she's missing. Now, at this point, they had no idea that the car had been located and towed. No one had put 2 and 2 together.
It took a few days, didn't it?
It took till Thursday. Yeah, Thursday, Bruce and Kelly went to the St. Albans State Police Barracks. And at that point, the trooper who had the car towed realized that, hey, that's the car that I had towed last week. That's when they determined that, where the car was and all that. So unfortunately, the by this time, the potential crime scene was almost a week old.
Right.
So
Can we talk about that crime scene a little bit? I know luckily there were some pictures from some tourists that happened by, correct?
Yeah, yes, there was some people, they called themselves the Travelers or something like that. And they were a bunch of people that went skiing together. And they went by Saturday morning and saw the scene and thought it was odd enough that they stopped and took pictures. Fortunately, because those are the pictures that we have of the scene and the only pictures that we have of the scene.
Yeah. The thing from the scene that sticks out in my mind is the fact that the car was backed in rather than forward. I know the police initially thought maybe it was an accident under the influence. I found it surprising the way the car was backed in. I think that's something that the public really sticks on quite a bit. You want to talk to us a little bit about the scene and the way the car was and some things that were there?
Yeah, and if it had been someone under the influence, I mean, I've seen some pretty strange things with cars driven by people who've been drinking. So I wouldn't necessarily automatically rule that out if I saw a situation like this.
Yeah, fair enough.
However, in looking at the scene, even though the house was burned in, I think it was 2016 by a group of teenagers who were ultimately caught and charged. So the only thing I actually saw was the foundation, but you could still see the mark on the foundation where her car was. And by looking at the car and the way the wheels are turned, in my mind, and again, this is just my opinion, it appears to me there's a sharp curve. The house is on a curve. Cars used to run off the road all the time when the Dutchburn brothers were there. That's why they didn't think twice about answering the door when someone rapped on it. So in my mind, the way the wheels are turned and the position of the vehicle, it looks to me like she was stopped on the road, realized something was wrong, threw it in reverse, and wound up backing into the house, and then got hung up and couldn't do anything. That's an opinion. That's not necessarily fact.
Gotcha. Thank you. Now, I know over the years, there have been several names that have been tossed around in the public, at least, for their connection to Brianna. Is there anyone that you want us to know has been cleared? We can forget about it. We can stop talking about it.
Well, officially, police agencies do not generally clear anyone.
Okay.
And the reason for that is just because a person maybe was found not to have been at the scene at the time or whatever, doesn't mean they're not involved somehow.
Right.
And if they were to find that out after saying, oh, this person's been cleared, and they ultimately charge them, that could hinder prosecution. So I wouldn't say that anyone has been completely ruled out. On the other hand, I wouldn't say that there's any evidence that any particular individuals have been involved. So any so-called suspects or anything else is at this point mere speculation. And there's been a number of people. I think the state police said there was 12 persons of interest. Well, obviously 12 people were not involved. So assumably at least 11 of those are not guilty.
Right.
So obviously to say that someone may or may not have been involved, it would not be fair to them. I mean, and if they're not involved, it almost makes them a secondary victim because people spread rumors, they talk about it, and ruin their reputation for no reason. So there's been a number of people that have been looked at, both by the state police and by the private investigators. And, while I'm on that track, I just want to mention Greg Overacker. Greg is from New York. He was working as a private investigator, a bounty hunter, process server. And he became aware of Brianna's case back in 2006, I think, and contacted Bruce and volunteered to help him out. And Greg has done an amazing job and has been with the case since then and is still with it. He and I talk a couple times a week. We work together, but he's really put in a lot of effort on this case, totally on his own, voluntarily. So between he and I and the state police, I think we've looked at a number of people, but up to this point, there's no solid evidence connecting any particular individual to it. There's a lot of rumors, but rumors aren't fact.
So when you look at the crime scene, was there anything to suggest that there had been any sort of struggle there? Anything to suggest she had been subject to violence? And then a follow-up with that, I'm also wondering, is this at all an area where like trafficking could happen? Or is there some other possible explanation other than an abduction and a murder?
Initially, it was suggested that maybe she had run away or taken off. And that's pretty far-fetched in my mind. Her medicine was left behind. All her possessions were left behind. That would be extremely unlikely that she would back into a building and decide to just take off. Doesn't make any sense. Was she trafficked? That's always a possibility. It isn't just because it's a rural area, wouldn't rule that out necessarily. But if you're familiar with the roadway up there, I mean, it's pretty quiet. The first time I was up there, I was on that scene for maybe 20 minutes, and I don't think 2 cars went by. This is in broad daylight. So we're talking March 19th, 11:30, 12 o'clock at night. There's not going to be a heck of a lot of traffic. So, anything is possible. I'd hate to rule out anything without having some, solid evidence. But most likely, in my mind at least, and I think in Greg's mind, and I think probably in Mr. Maitland's mind, is the fact that she was abducted. As far as evidence at the scene goes, again, the car was towed. We're not sure. There's a lot of unanswered questions. Was it in park? Was it in reverse? Was the battery dead? I mean, there's a lot of things that we'll probably never know just because it wasn't treated as a crime scene. Mm-hmm. And I don't want people to get the impression, that was totally messed up. The cars are left all the time. Extremely rare that one of them ultimately turns out to be an abduction. It happens, but it's not something that you run across every single day. So, I'm sure in the mind of the original trooper, it was just a routine abandoned car, no big deal.
I think that is really important to note, and I'm glad you did, because in these rural areas, that is so common. I remember we were in kind of a rural part of Hawaii, and there are cars just on the side of the road everywhere. And we were with a tour guide, and he's like, you never really have to buy new car parts because someone always crashes and you can just go take from their car when they leave it. You know, it's older cars. It's not worth fixing to people. They don't have the means to move it. There could be other reasons why they didn't. It could be, a DUI, something like that. So I'm glad you brought that up, because it's not like a car crashing in Boston or in a heavily populated suburb. It's a very different kind of way of life, I guess, than a lot of people might be used to.
Yeah, and like I said, there's no police presence. I mean, the small towns up there don't have police departments. State police have a wide area to patrol. So people are used to being self-reliant. And if you get in an accident, and you just do the best you can, get a ride home, call a tow truck, whatever. And like you said, it's not like Boston.
And I'm sure they figured the car would be just picked up, in a day or two, and we would move on with our lives. And unfortunately, it ended up being Brianna's car. And so here we are. Is there anything else about Brianna or the circumstances leading up to her disappearance that you feel like it's important for the public to know, or that would contribute to information about the case?
Just that there's some misconceptions, maybe. And the misconceptions lead to speculation, unwarranted speculation, and rumors. And I mean, there's the martial arts aspect of it. She had taken jiu-jitsu lessons when she was 14, I think. And that over time has morphed into the fact that she was a martial arts expert. And, she, as far as I know, she wasn't a martial arts expert at all. She had taken jiu-jitsu lessons, and that's a big difference there. Jiu-jitsu is a form of grappling, which is, like wrestling-based, ground-based, not something where it's not like karate, where it's an offensive type of martial art. As far as I know, I'm no expert on martial arts at all, but I don't know that the jiu-jitsu in this particular case would have been a big benefit to a 17-year-old, 105-pound young lady with minimal training. So that's kind of one thing that's out there a lot, that, again, another misconception that people might have.
I know in some of the research, it said that, she could have defended herself. It must have had to be, that was one of the things that I came across a lot in my research, was her jiu-jitsu training and how she could have, fought back. So thank you for pointing that out.
As I said, she maybe had made some poor choices relative to some of the people that she might have been associated with, but nothing totally outlandish for a 17-year-old girl. I mean, she had a sense of freedom, and she had been in an altercation with a friend of hers who accused her of maybe having a relationship or flirting with a boyfriend of hers. And that was a couple of weeks earlier at a party. And she had been beaten up pretty badly. She was sitting in a truck, and this other so-called friend hit her in the face a few times. She had black eyes, possibly a concussion. I'm not sure, but so there's a lot of speculation that maybe this girl was somehow involved. But again, she's a 17-year-old kid. It's a far cry to have a altercation to doing something, more serious to someone. So, and she was cleared. I say cleared. The state police don't believe she was involved, as far as I know.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Could you also clarify a little bit about the boyfriend? Because I know there's been a lot of misinformation circulating about him and his possible involvement.
Yeah, the ex-boyfriend, James Robitelli, lived in Montgomery. He's the one who went past and saw her vehicle there. And initially, he had told the state police that he went by at 4:30. Changed his story a few times. When I interviewed him, he said he went by at 2:30, and the reason he didn't tell the police that was the activity he involved in wasn't proper, so he didn't want them to be aware of that. The police, I think, they questioned him quite a bit, put a lot of pressure on him, and I don't believe they feel that he was involved. He has since was killed in a head-on car accident a couple of years back. Unfortunately, any information he might have went with him, but I really don't think he really had much to offer in the way of solving the case.
So my question to you is, and you don't have to tell us, obviously, of course, what your feelings are, but do you or the family have any sort of instinct as to whether you think this was stranger related or someone that she knew?
I've gone back and forth on this several times. In my own opinion, it was someone that did not know her. That's just my opinion, and I don't want to speak for anybody else. Part of the reason I say that is it happened near the Black Lantern in Montgomery. Not that many people knew she was working there. She'd only been there a couple of weeks. And after that altercation, she had kind of distanced herself from that group of friends. So there was the number of people that were aware of her job there is somewhat limited. Secondly, no one, including her, knew what time she was getting out of work. So, you'd have to just sit there for potentially hours waiting for her to come by. So I don't know why there. If it was someone none of her friends really were from Montgomery, Enosburg, and east and west of there, more so maybe north up in Richford. So why there? It's kind of it's right on the road. When they knew where she lived, it doesn't make a real good location for someone who would want to abduct her or whatever. Just to me, it doesn't make sense that they would do it at that particular location, knowing that she would be going further west, closer to where they all were from. But again, that's just pure speculation. There's no evidence to back that up.
Understood. Yeah. Now, I know that people at the Black Lantern did not see her leave with anybody. Do you think it's possible that somebody might have sneakily followed her from there, since that was a more public location than the Dutch Burn House?
It's possible. The owner did see her leave alone in her vehicle. Someone could have followed her and then would have had to pass her and block the road. And I suppose it's possible. Some people have said, well, maybe someone was hiding in the car. Well, that's a possibility, but how did they get out of there unless they had another vehicle or had someone else involved?
Right.
So, it doesn't, again, to me, it was a lone individual. Now, maybe there was more than one involved, but if there's more than one involved, I think it makes it more solvable. If it's just one individual and they keep their mouth shut and there's no forensic evidence tying them into it, you're never going to solve the case. One thing that bothers me a little bit is, what did happen to her? The ground was frozen, the water was frozen. Where did whoever take her?
That part sticks out to me so much too. It's cold up here. I recently moved to the country in Maine, and it's cold up here at night that time. And the other night I did a work event and I was driving home and I was really struck by how dark it was. I know at one point I actually thought the road up ahead of me did a sharp turn because it was so pitch black. And as I kept driving forward, I realized it wasn't. It was a very straight road. It was just that black ahead of my headlights. And I couldn't even believe that you could see all the stars. I was like, I'm from Massachusetts, so I was kind of amazed how you could see all the stars. And so when you were talking about how dark it was out there, that's just what sticks out to me so much. Poor Brianna, dark and cold. And I hope she wasn't too frightened. But speaking of, we spoke about, maybe who could have come upon her car, or who could have, whatever could have happened that caused her car to have to stop there. There is some new information. There was a little bit of an update to the case recently about the DNA. Can you tell us about that?
There was some DNA that was recovered from the vicinity of the vehicle several days after it was discovered that, what had happened, that the car had been there and all that. So it was at that point well over a week after the actual incident. And the DNA, the item was sent to Othram Lab out in Texas. Othram has done amazing work with genomic sequencing and familial DNA research and everything. And Dave Biddleman has done a great job out there. And they ultimately determined who the DNA belonged to. They were given, I think, 11 or 12 names by the state police as potential suspects or persons of interest, I should say. And none of those people matched. And that's one of the things that the media had gotten wrong. Some media outlets said that it matched one of the persons on the list. Well, that's not correct at all. They've identified the individual, but he was not a person of interest. And I do not believe he is a person of interest.
Thank you. That's really valuable information. So it doesn't necessarily mean that he was connected to her disappearance in any way, simply that he was in or around her car at some point, right?
Or in or around the area of where her car was found.
Yeah, gotcha. Okay.
Yeah.
So not even necessarily that he was connected to her.
Oh, correct. Absolutely. I mean, you're talking outdoors. You're talking on the side of the road. So it's not like it was something that was found in her vehicle or anything else. It was just at the scene in the vicinity of where the vehicle had been.
Could you tell us what that item was? Or
no.
Okay.
I'm sorry, but I can't.
That's okay. Thank you.
The thing about forensic evidence would be fingerprints or DNA or blood or whatever you find at the scene. First thing you have to do is locate it. Second thing you have to do is recover it. Third thing you got to do is analyze it, and fourth, identify it. And if you get all that done, now you've got to determine whether in fact that evidence is in fact connected to the scene. Think about your car. How many people have been in your car that have left DNA in there or fingerprints in there or whatever, maybe on a soda can or a cigarette or something along those lines. And then if something were to happen to you and they found that person's DNA, that doesn't necessarily mean they were involved. What it means was at some point in time they were at the scene. Same is true of a house or wherever. So just because there's DNA doesn't always mean that particular DNA is tied into the crime. Now, obviously, there are times, depending on the DNA, if it's a rape and they find semen and DNA, well, obviously that's going to tie that person into the crime. Or if there's a murder weapon and there's fingerprints on the murder weapon, that's going to tie the person into the crime. But it isn't always that easy to tie in whatever fingerprints or whatever else you might have to say that that person was definitely involved in some type of activity.
Right, certainly. Thank you. What do you think that the most helpful thing that the public can do for this case now going forward is? How can we help?
Well, I think what you're doing is great. Podcasts, getting information out there is, especially if it's accurate information, is very, very helpful. These types of investigations are solved through partnerships, through the police, the media, including podcasts. There's labs such as Othram doing DNA analysis, private investigators who sometimes can uncover information that the police can't because people sometimes are reluctant to talk to the police, what they will to a private investigator. And partially because the police don't always have the resources to devote to cold cases. They have new cases that come in that take priority, and they have to prioritize. And you can't take your investigators and say, okay, look at this 20-year-old case because we've got three active homicide investigations to do. So,
right.
Whereas the private investigators can focus on that case. And I credit the Vermont State Police immensely for recognizing the, I don't want to say ability, but the potential for private investigators to be able to assist them. They have been extremely helpful, cooperative. They've shared information with us. We've shared information with them. And I think they recognize that our presence can be beneficial. They also recognize that podcasts can be beneficial. Many agencies would not go anywhere near doing a podcast. Through the nonprofit, I talked to we look at a lot of cases, and I talked to a lot of police agencies, and some, like the Vermont State Police, are extremely cooperative. Some won't answer a phone, won't return a phone call. Sometimes you get the impression that they'd rather not have the case solved than have someone else solve it, which is very, very unfortunate. So I think the public can certainly help out by giving any information that they might have. And sometimes it does get, I won't say upsetting, but it's, you just shake your head when you hear the same rumors year after year that have been investigated. They take on a life of their own and you get the same tips. But I wouldn't want to discourage anyone from giving a tip if they had one, because, that you never know when that one piece of information might come in that's going to result in the investigation being solved.
Absolutely. And I think that the world is very lucky to have investigators like you who've put in a very full career already and then have taken the time to continue this work, clearly a work of the heart. And I think the world is lucky to have you. Will you tell us a little bit about Bruce Maitland's organization?
Yes, Bruce, as I said, I think, grew at times frustrated with the efforts of the authorities on the case. And, again, we're talking quite a while ago. All those people are gone now. They're retired. They've moved on. So there's a whole new administration, a whole new atmosphere within the organization. But when Greg came on board, he realized that there was a big advantage to having private investigators. And one of the things that his organization offers, I think probably the most important thing is, offers the family members of victims hope and knowledge that something's being done. Realistically, we're not going to go out there and solve every case that comes in. It just is not going to happen. Some of them are just plain not going to be solved. But at least they have the satisfaction of knowing that someone is trying. And I don't want to fault the law enforcement agencies for not trying, because they just sometimes can't. They can't do it. I have a case out in Texas where there's a young lady who was a runaway as a juvenile, hasn't been seen now since I think it was 2004 also. I talked to the detectives out there and they were like, oh, great. We'd love to have you work on the case because we can't. We don't have time to do it.
Yeah.
And he was very honest about it. He said, we just don't have the time. So they had started a reward fund for information. And it had an expiration date of, I think, 2018. And when that reward expired, he took the money and, based on his experience with his daughter's case, he started the nonprofit organization, Private Investigations for the Missing. And what that organization does is, if it's a case where we feel we can be of help, and if we have the resources to help, they will hire and pay for a private investigator to work on the case for the family at no cost to the family at all, no charge at all. So we have probably 6 or 8 active cases right now. The procedure is people will either call in or email, or there's a form they can fill out requesting. And normally what will happen, if Bruce will look at it and he'll send it to myself or one of the other screeners, and we look at the case and determine, is this something that we have the resources to do? Because sometimes people, it's obvious that they're lost in the woods. There's no private investigator's not going to help. We're not going to go out there and look in the woods. There's other organizations that can help, and then we can refer them sometimes to them, but nothing that we can really do. We also won't get involved in a active criminal investigation. And we run into some of them. And, usually when I talk to the police and they say, well, we're working on it, we got some leads, then, we don't want to interfere with anything, obviously, that law enforcement's doing. That's not what we're out there for, But if it's something that we do and we have the resources for, we've gotten requests for cases from New Zealand, from Belize, and we just can't, at this point in time, don't have the funds to be doing that.
Right.
So, we have to turn them down. Well, usually what I'll do is try and help them if I can, unofficially, maybe with resources or whatever. So then if I'll send that back to Bruce and say, okay, this is what I think, and he goes to the board of directors, and the board of directors then votes on whether or not to expend the funds to hire an investigator. Or sometimes, for instance, we have a case, Erica Franelich out of New York, that Greg actually initiated and has been working on and has done a heck of a job on. We paid for billboards, hopefully, to get some information. There's another case right now pending where we may be doing the same thing. So, it isn't always in supplying investigators, but sometimes we can help out in other ways. Fundraising, we've done fundraising, and we may be doing more relative to DNA analysis, because Othram charges, I think, $5,000, and the agencies, they're strapped for cash. And if it's a long shot, they're not going to expend the funds. But through podcasts and through GoFundMe's and everything, we've had pretty good success in sometimes raising money to pay for stuff like that, aside from investigators.
That's wonderful. And those are kind of some of our, long-term dream goals here too. We want to help participate in that and help in those ways as well. I love that you're doing that. And I think I can only imagine, certainly I've never been through it, but I can only imagine what a lonely place it must be to be the parent of a missing child or a missing person, adult even. And so having that support on your side, I'm sure, is absolutely invaluable to those families. And who would know better than Brianna's parents, right? So thank you so much for doing that. Thank you to them. And we will stay posted and stay tuned to that organization and any ways that we can help in the future. Please do feel free to come back and share any of those cases with us anytime you would like. You just let us know. I do have another question for you. As a private investigator, as an expert, I would say, in this area, what can you say to us as the public when we're doing our own research, when we're sharing things, when we're hearing articles, when we're watching documentaries, we're reading articles, we're seeing things? How can we stay diligent on separating rumor from fact?
I wish I had an answer for you. Because we run into the same thing. Sometimes what I will do is go back to the original media reports, because over time things change and the story gets changed. Like, for instance, the jiu-jitsu lessons turned into an expert at martial arts. If you go back to the beginning, sometimes that's where the information is the most accurate. Talking to people, we run into it all the time where it's misinformation, and you don't find that out necessarily right away. If you listen to some of the podcasts that have been done on Brianna's case, they have changed from the beginning till now. Right. Because as time goes by, you find out, well, okay, this lead was totally invalid. It was wrong. It was, and you're onto something else. So I wish there was an easy way to say, this is how you do it, but there is no easy way. Talking to the people involved as best you can is probably the most helpful. But the families of victims sometimes shy away from or get inundated with requests from media, and they get to the point where they want to back off from that. So as much as you can verify, I would, or put a caveat on everything saying we understand this, or this is what has been said, rather than this is what's fact.
Inundated sticks out to me as a word, because I'll be honest and say, kind of a lesson I learned myself in this situation. It never even occurred to me to reach out to you because I assumed you were inundated. I didn't think that her parents or that you would jump on the chance to have this conversation. And so I'm beyond grateful to you for noticing it and reaching out to us. And now we can set the record straight and get the most accurate information. As of beginning of April 2022, this is the most accurate information to date about Brianna's case. Is there anything else that you think that we should know about her or her disappearance or her case?
No, just I think in general, the victims, and this isn't necessarily, well, in a sense, maybe it is applied to this case also, but there are people out there who are exploitive, and not just in the media, but in private investigating. I mean, we've run into cases where people have hired private investigators, and private investigators who take a retainer and don't produce, and then they're off and they never hear from them again. This one particular case we were involved in, a woman went missing, and a family hired a private investigator, and this is like 7 years after the disappearance. They did surveillance on the suspect. Like, why? I mean, what did you expect you were gonna see? And they billed the client for this hours and hours of surveillance, and then that was the end of it. So, that's very obviously frustrating for the families. And I talked to a guy recently on a case. He's hired 6 private investigators, different ones at different times. And they take the retainers and they do minimal work and they disappear. There was a case not too long ago where a young lady by the name of Phoenix Caldone, who went missing out of East St. Louis years ago. And it's actually one of the PI for the missing cases. They got a call from an individual who claimed that he had her and put a young lady on the phone who kind of sounded like her, but wasn't her. And they wanted money. And this is common. What happens is the families, they put out Facebook pages, they put their information, sometimes even their phone numbers, and people exploit that. And they get all the information they can, and then they try and extort money out of them. It goes on and on. It's so that the families are victimized again.
Yeah.
The rumors, that in Brianna's case, that a individual with the state police said that it was drug related. Well, people hear that and they no longer sympathize with the victim, which is too bad because no one asks to be a victim. And they paper printed that and ultimately had to retract that. And it was retracted. Of course, it already set things in people's minds. And one of the things that Bruce has used as I'd say priority, but one of our, I guess maybe it is a priority, is cases from an underserved population. As the Gabby Petito case, where that white woman syndrome was talked about and everything, and there's some validity to that. I mean, you take a young minority male from the inner city who goes missing, nobody ever hears about it. You take a pretty little girl from the suburbs, and it grabs the media's attention, and then that spurs sometimes activity on the case, whereas these other cases just go by the wayside. There's a huge problem in the Native American population with people going missing, and no one really pays much attention. In the past, hasn't paid much attention to that. So one of the goals of the organization is to, I wouldn't say concentrate, but at least try and help out on these cases from the underserved populations as much as we can, recognizing that they don't get the attention sometimes that these other cases do.
We love that. That's something that's very important to us here as well, and something we've spoken about frequently. So we're glad to hear that. And we look forward to following those cases that you all have and hopefully sharing some more of those stories.
One area where potentially you could help, we need funding for the organization. We would love to get a corporate sponsor, obviously, a grant writer, looking for a grant writer, because right now we rely totally on donations. And some of the investigators like myself, we don't charge for our time. Some charge a very reduced rate. It depends on the investigator. We vet them very well. We just don't hire any investigator. We actually go through a process to make sure that they're qualified, and they've been very cooperative. I belong to an investigative group, and they vet the people very well. And I put out a request to see who might be interested. I figure we might get a half dozen. We got over 50 responses all over the world.
Wow.
From investigators saying, "Yeah, I'll help. Yeah, let me know what I can do." And so that's very gratifying. But they have a job too. They have to make a living. I'm retired. I'm fortunate. I have a pension, so I can afford to do this. But they're working for a living. They can't be stopping paid jobs to work on unpaid jobs. So we try and help them anyways as much as we can. But we need funding. That's our biggest thing right now.
Will you let the listeners know how we can find your organization?
Yeah, there's a number. I don't know if you see it behind me now. 866-331-6660. That's our tip line, or piftmtips@gmail.com, or our website, Investigations for the Missing, has contact information. So any of those would be good. One thing I want to note also, Bruce has kept his daughter's case out of the organization. In other words, no nonprofit money is spent on his daughter's case. Any money that's expended from that comes from him, and he's very careful to separate the two, because he doesn't want people thinking he's out there raising money to do his own daughter's case. That's not the case. So,
well, he sounds like a wonderful man. And we speak frequently on this show about the strength of the parents and the things that the parents have gone on to do in the names of their children, laws that have been created, legacies. We did an episode on Amber Hagerman, so Amber's Law, Amber Alerts. Those are huge things and important things. And it sounds like the Maitlands they've really got their whole heart in this, not only for Brianna, but for other families too, so they don't have to hopefully suffer the way that they've had to suffer. I think that's really admirable.
That's true. The Molly Bish case, which I'm sure you're familiar with, her parents, her sister have been heavily involved in the Molly Bish Foundation and trying to get legislation changed. We have a case in Pennsylvania named Jesse Farber, and his mother just had legislation passed in Pennsylvania requiring that DNA be submitted into the database on every missing person, because that's not mandated. There's only, I think, maybe 8 states that do that, have to do that. Many do, but they're not required to. And there are cases out there where it doesn't get entered, believe it or not. So
I can't understand why anyone wouldn't.
I don't know. I mean, again, it's lack of time, lack of resources, lack of money, lack of effort. I don't know. Again, it depends on the agencies.
Well, do you have any more questions for Chief Barry, Amelia?
No, I just want to say thank you so much for coming on. Thank you again for reaching out to us. That way we could have this conversation and we could correct some of those misconceptions out there. And thank you for all the hard work you're doing for Brianna's case and for all these other missing girls.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to, again, get the information out there because, it helps. That's how we're going to solve the case, I think. So your cooperation and everything is appreciated. And it would have been very easy when I contacted you to just say, well, the podcast's up, but it's going to stay it. But, you took the time and effort to correct the information that was not 100% accurate. So that's appreciated also.
Yeah, that's important to us. And thank you so much for reaching out. I don't know if you hadn't, I don't know that we would have known because the rumors are so rampant. If I believed them when I was doing my research, I'm sure our listeners would have as well. And so if you hadn't reached out to us, I don't know how much we would have known, and it probably would have stayed up. So today is, serendipity or whatever. We're grateful that we could all come together and clear this all up for Brianna's sake. Every episode, at the end of the episode, we do what is called a call to action, where we give the information about the person and we ask our listeners to take some actions. I do want to describe Brianna a little bit and give you that call to action for her, but I want to add an addendum to it. While we are here, please, please, please check out Private Investigations for the Missing. If you happen to have any access to those resources that Chief Barry was mentioning earlier, reach out to them, see where you can help. And we like to encourage people to, if you feel inspired, to share your funds for fundraising efforts. That is where we would like to direct you to go on this case. So we will put those sources in our show notes so you can go straight to Private Investigations for the Missing. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about Brianna and the time she was last seen right now. I'm going to do it while you're still here, Chief Barry, because if I make any mistakes, I want you to correct me. Brianna Maitland was last seen March 19th, 2004 at the Black Lantern Tavern and Inn in Montgomery, Vermont. Her pale green 4-door 1985 Oldsmobile sedan was located on March 20th, 2004 off East Berkshire Road on Route 118 across from the Dutchburn Farm Road, about a mile outside of Montgomery. At the time of her disappearance, Brianna was described as a Caucasian female with brown hair and hazel eyes, around 5'3" to 5'8", 105 to 118 pounds. Brianna has a faint scar extending from her left eyebrow to her forehead. Her left nostril is pierced. She wore a small ring or stud in it at the time of her disappearance. She wears contact lenses and takes prescription medication for migraines, but all of that was left behind when she vanished. Brianna's nicknames are Bree and B, and she was 17 at the time of her disappearance. She would be turning 36 this year. If you have any information about the disappearance of Brianna Maitland, you can call the Vermont State Police, or you can call Private Investigations for the Missing at 1-866-331-6660, or you can Gmail Private Investigations for the Missing, PIFTM tips@gmail.com. Thank you so much again. We just cannot thank you enough for being here and for helping us, make sure we get the details right so that we can hopefully be of some service to this case.
I thank you. And anytime I can be of help, if you have a question about this case or any other case that I might be able to help you with, feel free to reach out. And
thank you. Much appreciated. And we will definitely reach back out about future cases. That's all we have for you tonight, but we will be back next week with another unsolved case. You can find shareable content on our social media at Lost Souls of America and our website, lostsoulsofamerica.com. Please share often and help spread awareness for their cases. These are the stories of the voiceless. These are the Lost Souls of America.